Can you see my slide?
Yes.
All right. So I wanted to start by thanking Linda for inviting me to participate. This is exciting. I've enjoyed both talks so far, and it's neat to learn about the different contexts. And my talk's going to be similar to Colleen's from the perspective I'm looking at state and federal policies related to teaching out of field. So what I want to start with is just to make sure that everybody's on the same page about the US context. So the federal laws that address issues of teaching, and they explicitly address issues of teaching out of field. We had the No Child Left Behind Act in 2002 that allowed teaching out of field only in very rare cases. Teachers had to be considered highly qualified, which meant essentially they had to be trained to teach the subjects that they were teaching. That changed in 2015 with a new federal policy called the Every Student Succeeds Act. That new policy actually allows teaching out of field, but it defines it from an equity standpoint, which I thought was interesting. It says that if you allow teaching out of field, or if you have teachers who are teaching classes out of field, then it has to be equitably distributed among your students. So the different demographic variable, if you group the students by demographic variables, the students have to be treated equally. If you're a rural student or an urban student, then the out-of-field teaching rates have to be similar across the different groups. So to understand the Texas context, because in some ways it sounds like it's very different from the Australian context, teachers in Texas can hold certification or licenses in lots of different subjects. So it addresses that issue of somebody went through their undergraduate and potentially master's degrees and got trained in something, but then received additional professional development. They can get licenses for each of the different subjects that they have demonstrated the skills and knowledge to teach them. So they take a test that demonstrates their pedagogical content knowledge, and then they are licensed to teach that additional subject. It sounds somewhat similar and somewhat different in that we have different grade bands of the different licenses. So from early childhood through grade 6, you're a generalist, but in the 4 through 8 and the secondary grades, they're subject specific. So you can get certified to teach biology, you can get certified to teach chemistry, physics, maths, things like that. And Texas has very detailed rules for what licenses correspond to what classes you can teach. So it's a very clear definition of who is teaching in field or out of field. So this is an example of teachers who teach maths in grades 9 through 12. You can hold any one of these licenses and you are considered in field. If you don't hold one of these licenses, then you're considered out of field. This document is 110 pages long, showing the relationship between licensures and courses that can be taught. And it goes through all the different kinds of courses that you might see in any of the grade levels. So I want to make clear that when I use the term out of field, I'm referring to the classes and not to the teacher, him or herself. So I look at out of field teaching similar to what we've heard already this morning or today, is that out of field is not a characteristic of the teacher, but a description of the misalignment between the teacher's qualifications and the course being taught. So a teacher who holds a chemistry license or certification in Texas and teaches chemistry is teaching in field, but that same teacher teaching algebra would be teaching out of field. And I love Ingersoll's quote about teaching out of field is equivalent to assigning a cardiologist to deliver babies, or a real estate lawyer to defend criminal cases, a chemical engineer to design bridges, or a sociology professor to teach English. To me, it's just, it's bad policy. Because we know that teaching out of field matters. That when teaching out of field happens, there's less student academic growth, there's lower quality instruction in general, and there's higher teacher attrition. So the research questions that my colleague and I were looking at were, did the rate of out-of-field assignment change when we went from the No Child Left Behind Act to the Every Student Succeeds Act? So there was the federal policy that then trickled down into the state policies. And then because the focus in the Every Student Succeeds Act was on equity, we wanted to look at it from an equity perspective. Is it equitable for teachers who are being assigned to the different kinds of classes? And is it equitable for students? And what we did is, this is a large-scale quantitative study. We used a P20 data warehouse. And what I did is I compiled 300 million records of every student, every class, every teacher, and every licensure that the teacher held. And from that 300 million records, I took a sample of 180 million, which was just the classes in grades 7 through 12, just the secondary grades. And so that constituted 14.9 million different classes. So this is, I'm actually looking at the class level, the particular period class. And so I analyzed these 180 million records, and what I'm going to talk about is the basis of is based on these data. And I used the official state published rules on what constitutes in-field or out-of-field. So what we found for the first research question was that there was a dramatic increase. This is when the policy changed at the federal level. And this line looks fairly flat here, but it's actually, there's no significant change year to year on this side of the line, but every year after the policy changed, the change was significant increase in the number of classes that were being taught out of field. And then you see an astronomical increase in the final year of the data that we had available. So then what we did is we looked at it by the 25 most common subjects that are being taught in grades 7 through 12. And this is ranked from the highest in-field teaching rates to the lower ones. The really low ones are off the chart. But what you can see is the STEM fields where in Texas it was believed that that's the highest out-of-field teaching rates actually have some of the lowest out-of-field teaching rates relatively. You can see math, almost 76% of the teachers, the classes were being taught in field. But we're looking at over 2 million different classes. So we're talking about over 500,000 classes that are still being taught out of field. So it sounds like a small percentage, but because the number is big, we're talking an enormous number of kids who are being impacted by this. And this was, I found super surprising, is that the English classes are actually being taught out of field at a higher rate than the math and STEM classes were. Okay, so research question 2 was about the equity of the teacher assignment. And what we found was that teachers were not equitably being assigned. It varied by demographic variables and training characteristics. So we found that if you were a Black teacher in Texas, you were significantly more likely to be assigned out of field classes. If you were prepared through Texas is one of the leaders in alternative teacher preparation, mostly through for-profit companies. If you were trained through an alternative preparation program, then you were much more likely to teach out-of-field classes. If you were, again, like is in Australia, if you're working in rural. And I expected to see, similar to what Linda was talking about, or Colleen was talking about, the newer teachers teaching out of field at a higher rate. And I found that the older the teacher was, the more likely they were to be teaching out of field. And then we have a pedagogy licensure test that they also have to pass it. And the lower they scored on that test, the more likely they were to teach out of field, which I thought was really interesting. And we want to dig into this more. Research question 3 was about the student equity issue. Are students being equitably allocated or assigned or taking classes out of field versus in field? And the answer is no. If you're a Black student, you're much more likely to take classes out of field. Same thing for males. So females take more in-field classes, males take more out-of-field classes. You come from a low-income family, regardless of the SES of the school you're in. If you come from a low-income, if you come from a low-income family, then you're more likely to have a class that's out of field. Again, living in rural communities, if you're receiving special education services, you're much more likely to take out-of-field classes, and if you're a non-native English speaker. So we recently published this study. Amy Piot was a grad student that worked with me on this study, so it was recently published. And so we also did a couple additional analyses that they're preliminary. We haven't finished them yet. But what we're looking at was the new teachers are rated by their principal for quality and effectiveness. And we looked at the principal ratings of new teachers as a function of whether the number of classes the principal had assigned the teacher to teach out of field. And what we found is each additional class that the principal assigned the teacher to out of field, the lower the principal rated that teacher. And the rating is done at the end of the school year. So they assign them to teach out of field, and then they give them lower ratings, which have impacts on teacher preparation programs in Texas. And then we also found that teacher attrition is higher. What we're also trying to look at is the school employment environment, and is that, does that explain more of the attrition, or is it the teaching out of field rate that explains more of it? So the implications were that federal policies can impact principals' assignments of teachers to the classes in substantial ways. Part of the idea behind the federal policy was to give states local control and to define their own education policies. Well, what we're seeing is in Texas, when you give Texas government local control, then the teaching out of field increased dramatically. Teachers are not treated equitably, and students are not treated equitably. So next steps for this study is we're going to finish the principal evaluation analysis and the attrition analyses. Since I've got the 180 million records already set up, I'm going to do value-added modeling and look at student academic outcomes across the different subjects. And then we're also trying to find out what is it in schools where there's high out-of-field teaching rates, and yet students seem to be doing well, or teachers are staying at the school. Are there things that the principal is doing, or that the teacher professional learning communities are doing to support each other that other schools could adopt to counteract the negative effects of teaching out of field? So we've been looking for grant funding for this last one because of the travel that would be involved. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So we start with Marcel. He wants to know, how do you ban out of field teaching in the first place? What happened to the lessons previously to 2015? You see the question.
Yeah, so the No Child Left Behind had a lot of student assessment that was incorporated into it, and that student parents and state governments really balked at the student testing aspect of the law. And districts were having, school districts and schools were having a hard time hiring teachers, especially in rural communities. They were having a hard time, you know, when you've got a community of 1,000 people, getting somebody to come out of one of the larger cities and to go into those rural communities was very difficult. So there was a lot of pushback where people were, principals and superintendents of school districts were saying, we just can't hire the teachers. It's too expensive. We can't do this. And the rewriting of the policy basically the federal government threw up their hands and said, okay, you have control. And they're taking the lower cost route, it seems like.
Okay, that also explains a bit the question, or answers the question of Doreen, who asked, why was a policy to teach out of field permitted in 2015? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's that same issue. Is they had such a hard time filling all of their slots that they basically wanted control to do whatever they wanted.
Yeah. Okay, then I turn over to John Clark. He might explain or extend on his view a bit more himself. I cannot see him, but he's somewhere. Hi, John.
Hi, Jim. No, you actually dealt with it towards the end, that last little what you want to go on to in future, because I think, yes, seeing where schools are doing well, even though they've been adversely impacted, we can start to see some of the other factors that are involved there, and not just the principal, but the way the community is supporting it, or the way teachers support each other. I think would be very interesting. So let's hope you get the money to do that.
Yeah, because we totally believe that there's got to be schools that are doing a good job of teaching their kids, even though the teachers are teaching subjects they weren't licensed or certified to teach. So what are they doing? How are they being successful? So,
I mean, I have personal experience here because we did our physics at senior years with a teacher who was not only qualified in physics, but was not qualified in science at all. And that produced a professor of physics. I'm quite a successful physics graduate. And it was successful because the community of students actually got together and taught themselves. And that was because, we were fairly rich and very well educated and were able to do it. But there's lots of other factors going on there besides just qualifications of teachers. And it'd be nice to try and capture that in some way.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, thank you, John. You also pointed out one issue that I think is very interesting because it also fits to the German context, that on the elementary level, on the, you say junior, we would say lower secondary level, the likelihood to be out of field or to be taught out of field is higher, and then it's a bit lower, or we don't know for Germany, but we assume that it's lower on the senior level. So this is kind of a development that might be interesting and might be influence, of course, the student's career. I think it's a very interesting point. I don't know if Jim, it doesn't really.
Well, I have data to address some of this. So what we did is we also looked at changes in teaching out of field rates in a particular subject across grade levels. Mm-hmm. So starting from grade 7, looking through grade 12. And so like in English, the highest out of field teaching rate was in grade 12, slightly lower in grade 11, slightly lower again in grade 10. So as you got earlier in the school years, the out-of-field rates were lower, mm-hmm. But as you went toward senior, what we call senior year, the 12th year, then the rates of out-of-field teaching got higher, which we were really surprised at. But we saw that pattern for almost every single subject we looked at. So
okay, very interesting. I thought it's a different the way around. So it's the infield is more likely to be in senior years, but it's interesting to know. Yes, and then I want to turn over to Linda. She says your analysis is terrific. And she wants to know, do you think having this data helps policymakers understand the issues and justify initiatives to enhance the issues?
I'm hoping. That's my hope. So I think that's why one of my next steps is to look at the value-added modeling and to look at academic outcomes. So connect the actual inequity that exists in the teaching and the students, and then to show that there's really a negative consequence on the students. So in Texas, our Texas Constitution says that students have to be equitably educated. And if Black students are getting taught out of field at a higher rate, and then they're having less academic growth because of that, then to me, there are serious constitutional issues, serious equity issues that are going to have to be addressed at the highest level, both within the state and federal government. So I'm hopeful that it has a policy impact. So.
Yeah, because one of the things that we would like, certainly in our area, our part of Australia, is to have some figures, you know, to have that data collected, which we don't at all. We don't have any data collected at that central level. We're relying on, you know, it's studies that relies on teachers actually choosing to do the surveys or principals to do the surveys, and you just don't get those accurate numbers.
Right.
That's the problem. I mean, in New South Wales, they have the numbers because I know that principals, this is my understanding, Tracy, correct me if I'm wrong, but that principals have access to a database that shows for their teachers what they're approved to teach and what they're, there's that other measure of, another measure of suitability for teaching. And is that right, Tracy? Is that your understanding that principals have access to
the deep schools, so Department of Education schools do, yes. I think that's part of when you put your certificates in for accreditation, and we're now all in accreditation period here. That rolls over every 5 years, but you need to have submitted what degrees you've done and what subjects you've done, and then the department deems what you're qualified to teach or not to teach. Wow. It's a little bit different in independent schools where they've got control over who they employ, so not quite so rigid. So you can be working in an independent school. You have to have teach qualifications, but you don't. It's not recorded in the same amount of detail.
Yeah, and the hope is that if we have that data, then we'd be able to know what the situation is. We can attend to the issue, maybe recruit the teachers that are needed, maybe put, you know, funding in areas to upskill teachers. But it looks like, I mean, even when that data is available, you still have high levels of out of field. So maybe you know, there's something else that's needed other than just numbers to make this happen.
Well, what has existed in Texas up until our study was that the schools were surveyed as to whether or not their teachers were teaching out of field and whether or not the distribution was equitable. And the surveys make it look like there's no out of field teaching and that it's, of course, equitable. So the mismatch between what the schools are saying is happening and what the reality is this study is going to show that there's a discrepancy.
Okay, the last is a more entry is more like a comment from Colleen. Colleen, you want to say it yourself, maybe?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Jim, and I think it's terrific that you're gathering the data on the basis of the students' experience and the training of the teacher. Of course, it doesn't necessarily guarantee the knowledge and the pedagogical skills, but to take it from that perspective. And I think I know, I can't remember which is which, the TIM study or the PISA study, but one of them counts the number of students that have a teacher out of field, another one counts the number of teachers. I think it's the PISA study that's focused on the students. I can't remember, but one of them takes that approach. And so you end up thinking, oh, in Australia, there was only 23% of the teachers were out of field or something like that in 2015. I forget which study it was. But then when you looked at the other study, it said something like 43% of students in